Right, good evening, everybody. Hopefully you've all got the handout that I could see Hannah giving out to you then, just to make sure you have a bit of work to do during tonight's lecture as well. So, welcome to tonight's Ushaw lecture. Of course, we had the first one in January, and now we have the next one, the middle one of this term, and then of course we'll have the last, which I'll talk about at the end. And so, once again, tonight's lecture will show what we've been talking about generally, about widening the scope, about the materials that are held here at Ushaw and linking into those materials. So today, in some ways, we're going to be talking about geography, or what I would view as geography. And I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, who is Professor Maurice Whitehead, who, as you can see, is a Schwarzenbach Research Fellow at the Venerable English College in Rome. So at the moment, he's kind of doing similar to what the university is doing here at Ushaw, and that is beginning to research what is in the archives in the English College, and to sort it out and to let people like me then go and have a look at it more easily. But he's also, did I say, an Honorary Research Fellow with the Centre for Catholic Studies, so he has very close ties with us already. He has even closer ties, because some of you may know that he was actually Hannah's PhD supervisor, so he's to blame for Hannah. I should also say, as well, to encourage you to give him a really good welcome tonight, that a certain PhD student, when they gave their first paper, he was very nice to them. So please be nice to him tonight as a way of paying him back to it. So tonight he's going to talk about a local from this area who was a Jesuit. If we can talk about Jesuits in this building, as we've alluded to before, with its fierce history of anti-Jesuitism before the 20th century. We're talking about maps, meridians and missions. Christopher Maire, a Durham cartographer in Enlightenment Italy. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for your presence here this evening. And thank you, James, for your kind introduction. It's a real privilege and pleasure to have the opportunity of giving this evening's lecture, not least in the university where I was an undergraduate more than 40 years ago. And I'm greatly honoured by the university in being appointed as an honorary fellow in the Department of Theology and Religion. I'm delighted to be back here at Ushaw, which I visited many times during my student days here. It's a particular pleasure to see in the audience this evening Dr. Ian Doyle, sitting in the front row here. During my time as an undergraduate here, the late Dr. Dudley Butler Wilson, who was then reader in the Department of French and later became professor of French, and Elizabeth Rainey from the University Library, operated with Dr. Doyle a pioneering optional course for undergraduates in the humanities entitled Manuscript to Print, Tradition and Innovation in the Renaissance Book, which appeared as a Durham University Library Guide in 1975. But we were the guinea pigs, if you like, before that guide was ever published. And the course concerned itself with manuscript production, early printed books and their production, incunabula, and the relationship between manuscript and early print. And little did I realize then just how important that course and the relevance of that course would be in the future. It's hugely relevant in my current work today at the Venerable English College in Rome, working with an Italian archivist colleague, taking care of the oldest British archival collection outside Britain, which dates back to the foundation of the English and Welsh Pilgrim Hospice in Rome in 1362. We have archives right from the beginning to the present day. That's a big responsibility to have, but thanks to that work all those years ago by Dr. Doyle, I feel all the stronger in doing the work I am doing today. When I was invited last year to give this lecture, it seemed appropriate to try and link in some way some aspect of the history of the Venerable English College with Durham history. And this evening's lecture is devoted, as James has already explained, to the 18th century English Jesuit cartographer Christopher Maire, born just a few miles from here, who was rector of the English College in Rome from 1744 to 1750, immediately before co-directing one of the greatest geographical surveys of the 18th century. It is therefore a very special privilege and pleasure to offer this lecture this evening in my own alma mater, in Christopher Maire's home county, on this very day, the 250th anniversary of his death, in Ghent, in Flanders, on the 22nd of February, 1767. This evening's lecture deals in microcosm with two major issues which in many ways dominated intellectual debate internationally during the second half of the 18th century: religion and enlightenment. And I'd like to explore the theme in three ways: with a short introduction exploring the current fast-changing historiographical background relating to that subject of religion and enlightenment, and then in the second part to explore the life and work of Christopher Maire as a contributor in his own way to the Enlightenment. And that will be in two parts: a substantial part outlining and analysing historical fact relating to his life and work, and a much shorter part dealing with historical fiction. And if I've already lost you at this stage on mystifying you on a reference to historical fiction, I promise all will be revealed in due course. Then the third and final part will be a brief concluding analysis of the enduring significance of Maire's scientific work. In much of the academic world of the present day, as well as in the popular imagination, the Enlightenment still figures largely as a secular phenomenon, indeed as the very source of modern secular culture. In many contemporary academic circles, the cliché of a unitary enlightenment is invariably viewed as the starting point of secular modernity and rationality. However, the Enlightenment was emphatically not a unified movement and had many manifestations. Argument and debate over religion was key. There were debates over toleration, over the relationship between church and state, over the supernatural, over the freedom to publish heterodox views. And all of these contributed to Enlightenment debate, including within the Roman Catholic Church. Arguably the greatest single intellectual monument of the Enlightenment, the Encyclopédie, compiled by the French philosophe Denis Diderot as the first attempt in human history to gather all human knowledge into a large single compendium, was in the process of being compiled during Christopher Maire's lifetime, and its full 35 volumes here displayed were not completed until 1780, a full 13 years after Maire's death. We forget at our peril that the Encyclopédie contains many individual articles which were written by Catholics, including by members of the Catholic clergy in France. Indeed, as I hope to demonstrate amply by the end of this lecture, the Catholic Church in the 18th century was emphatically not afraid of science, but indeed took a leading role in advancing scientific knowledge. In 2011, David Sorkin, professor of history and Jewish studies at the University of Wisconsin, published this new book entitled The Religious Enlightenment: Protestants, Jews, and Catholics from London to Vienna. And in this volume, Sorkin argues that religion and the Enlightenment were in extensive dialogue in the 18th century, and that it was the French Revolution and its Napoleonic aftermath that did two things. First of all, completely destroy an existing religious enlightenment, and secondly, it created what Sorkin terms an artificial religious-secular dichotomy that condemned the religious dimension of the Enlightenment to historical obscurity and, in the process, distorted historical truth. Rescuing the religious contribution to the Enlightenment from that obscurity, he argues, is much more than academic interest. Indeed, its ramifications are of the first importance today in a world daily in danger of becoming more and more fragmented because of misconceptions, misunderstandings, and misrepresentations of and about matters of faith, religious belief and practice. The important work of rescuing from obscurity the religious dimension of the pre-1789 Enlightenment, not least in a Catholic context, has now been in train for some decades and is ongoing. Time this evening does not allow any deep exploration of the area, but a slide or two may hopefully demonstrate the rich research and publication in this field, which is alive and well. Books on Catholic Enlightenment in Europe, Benedict XIV and Enlightenment. I'll be talking more about Benedict XIV's role and Christopher Maire's links with him. Enlightenment and Catholicism in Europe, all recent publications. Other work here on the visual culture of the Catholic Enlightenment in the middle there, of the book on Catholic Enlightenment. There's lots of material on this subject, and in a specifically English context, we've got Abbot Geoffrey Scott's 1992 volume on the English Benedictines in the time of the Enlightenment, Gabriel Glickman's book on the early 18th century, my own recent contribution on Jesuit education in the Enlightenment, and a recent volume on Catholic identity in the Enlightenment. There's a lot going on. But there's a lot yet to be done, because the Catholic Enlightenment is not yet fully integrated into the historiographical mainstream, despite the efforts of historians thus far. Quick illustration of this, the book on the left, Educating the Child in Enlightenment Britain, Beliefs, Cultures and Practices, does contain a chapter on Catholic education during the Enlightenment. And the a more recent volume on philosophy and religion has no mention at all of the Catholic dimension. So there's clearly still work to be done. The historiographical problem is compounded further by historiographical problems in the field of cultural history. The culturally vibrant Rome that 18th century prelates, artists, popes, and grand tourists inhabited has for too long remained largely absent from certain histories of Italian artistic and cultural endeavor. Historians in general, and historians of art in particular, have not always been complimentary about the Roman Settecento, or 18th century. Indeed, since the 19th century, historians viewing this period as a period of decline in the international influence of the papacy have also jumped to the conclusion that the decreasing power of the papacy politically automatically meant that other areas of cultural undertaking by the papacy must also be marked by a lessening of quality and prestige. But recent and continuing scholarship is demonstrating how totally wrong-headed this view is. Amid this developing debate, I hope that what I might say this evening about Christopher Maire will provide a very small contribution to this process of awareness raising about the dynamism of the Catholic contribution to the Enlightenment, and help in a small way dispel some of the myth that the papacy in the mid-18th century was intellectually and culturally moribund. Whenever I give a lecture about an individual historical personage, I try, if possible, to provide an artist's portrait of the individual. I believe this really brings the person alive. But unfortunately, there is no surviving portrait of Christopher Maire. I think one probably existed from the time that he was rector of the Venerable English College. Every rector, as far as we know, up to the French Revolution had their portrait painted, as they still do today. We have a complete set from the 19th century onwards, but all the pre-French Revolution portraits were captured, seized by the French, and have never been seen since. We're onto the track of all sorts of objects which went missing at the time of the French Revolution. That's another story. Have not yet found Christopher Maire's portrait. However, according to the Durham antiquarian Robert Surtees, writing in the early 1820s, the Maire family arrived in County Durham in the late medieval period from Cheshire, from the village of Maire, just north of Knutsford, from which place they took their surname, which has variant spellings, as you can see on the screen. The family settled at Hardick near Hartlepool, and during the reign of Elizabeth I, the Maires conformed to the Church of England. However, the defining moment in terms of the future Catholic identity of this branch of the Maire family occurred very close to Durham city in 1590. As you will well know, on the 27th of May 1590 at Dryburn Gallows, the execution of took place the execution of four young Catholic priests, Edmund Duke, Richard Hill, John Hogg, and John Holliday, who had been captured some weeks earlier, shortly after their arrival back as newly ordained priests from the continent. Their executions were witnessed by Robert Maire and his wife, Grace Smith, the great-grandparents of Christopher Maire, the subject of this evening's lecture. So shocked, horrified, and moved were they by those Dryburn Gallows executions that the Maires became Catholics shortly thereafter, and their descendants, many of whom became priests and nuns, were in the 17th and 18th centuries to help shape the future of Catholicism in County Durham and, as we shall see later, much further afield. Christopher Maire, the subject of this lecture, was born on the 6th of March, 1697 at Hartbushes, some 12 miles southeast of here, the son of Christopher Maire Sr. and Francis Ingleby of Lakeland in the West Riding. Christopher Jr. was one of 10 children, 8 sons and 2 daughters. And the slide here shows the family. When this was produced a century ago, people weren't sure about these 2 members of the family, but they are in fact brothers of Christopher. A total of 8 children of Christopher Maire Sr. and Francis Ingleby were to enter religious life. Mary Euphrasia and Catherine Eugenia, the 2 daughters, were to enter the convent of the English Poor Clares at Dunkirk, and 6 of the sons were to become priests. 2 became members of the secular clergy, and 4 became Jesuits. 2 other sons, John and George, remained laymen, and George married, and in turn 2 of his sons, Edward and George, also became Jesuit priests. 5 other Maire cousins became priests as members of the secular clergy, 3 of them serving the Catholic mission in Durham city at various times down to 1767. The extended Maire family was well connected to the Catholic landed gentry of the northeast of England and of other parts of the country. They married into the Salvin family of Croxdale, the Silvertops of Minster Acres, the Applebys at Rommelkirk, the Meynell family, and the Gascoignes of Parlington. Christopher Maire Sr. of Hartbushes, the father of the subject of this lecture, as I said, had married Frances Ingleby. He married into the prosperous attorney gentry class in Yorkshire, and is either her father or uncle, Sir Charles Ingleby of Lakeland, who died in 1719, who headed the register of Catholic landholders in the West Riding of Yorkshire in 1717. Be that as it may, the surviving evidence indicates that the purse of Christopher Maire Sr. of Hartbushes and his wife Frances Ingleby was seriously stretched in bringing up their large family. Young Christopher demonstrated precocious talent of a very high order as a geographer and a cartographer. Where he received, or from whom he received his earliest education, presumably somewhere here in County Durham, and how his cartographical skills were guided and nurtured is, as far as I am aware, not yet known. Christopher Maire must surely have received expert geographical and cartographical tuition of the very highest order, because at the age of 14, in 1711, he produced a magnificent map entitled A New Map of the County Palatine of Durham. Here it is displayed. Critics of the early 18th century were often scathing about the low levels of proficiency in contemporary cartography in a Britain which they argued had depended for far too long throughout the 17th century on Dutch map-making expertise. A not uncommon cry was British cartographers took too many shortcuts in their work, simply copied and recopied existing maps, confused place names, and omitted important roads from their supposedly new maps. If this was truly the case, generally, I'd be most grateful at the end of this lecture to receive suggestions, please, from yourselves as to who might have tutored locally the young Christopher Maire to produce at the age of 14, it's very clearly labelled, I'll come to the caption in a moment, a map of this sophistication and exactitude, and lacking the faults commonly levelled at cartographers at that time. As you'll see from the close-up slide here, Maire personally dedicated and presented his map to the Dean and Chapter of Durham. The then Dean, Dr. John Montague, a former Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, and a former Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University, was also a nephew of the then Bishop of Durham, Nathaniel Crewe. And what particularly motivated Maire to make this dedication is, to me, not entirely clear. Clearly, it was a map of the County Palatine. The Prince Bishop was there, but I'd love to know more about that background. Shortly after producing this map, we think, we're not exactly sure the exact date, Maire was sent to the continent for his continuing education. Indeed, over a period of years, all the Maire of Hartbush's boys were educated on the continent, some at the English College at Douai, and others at the English Jesuit College at Saint-Omer, or St. Omer's College in its anglicised form. These were the two foremost English Catholic schools for boys in continental Europe, amongst the many English Catholic schools and colleges that you have on page 4 of your handout on the map. So probably about 1712, at the age of 15, Christopher Maire was sent to St. Omer's and stayed there until the age of 18. By this time, his father appears to have fallen into dire financial straits. The normal school fee at St. Omer's was £25 per annum, but Christopher Maire Sr. managed in 1713 to negotiate a much reduced school fee of £10 per annum for young Christopher, as well as the possibility of a similar reduced rate for his two younger brothers. However, the records show that the boy's father had difficulty even paying these special rates. Thomas Pearson, a Jesuit priest stationed here in Durham at the time, was called upon to provide his Jesuit confreres at St. Omer's College with his own assessment of the abilities of the Maire boys. And by February 1714, Thomas Coxon, an English Jesuit priest based in London, whose job it was to collect school fees from parents sending their boys to St. Omer's, informed the rector of St. Omer's College that, quote, Christopher Maire's father will pay no more for him, having paid £10, which is all that Mr. Pearson in Durham writes he told us the said Mr. Maire would pay. The rector of St. Omer's was to record in his letter book in February 1714, Christopher Maire's father unkind. Yet, for the deserving son's sake, I will trouble him no more, and will accept but one of his other sons for the bargain made at £10 per annum. And Thomas Coxon was to reply that if the next Maire's son that the rector took for £10, quote, be as good a wit as Christopher, the charity is well bestowed, end of quote. At St. Omer's College, Christopher Maire followed the normal humanities course then common in any Jesuit college, with a heavy emphasis on the learning of Latin and Greek to a high level. The surviving documentary evidence seems to suggest that geographical studies there were truly up to date. These two imprints survive today at Stonyhurst College in Lancashire, which is the lineal descendant of St. Omer's College, and it seems that studies at St. Omer's in that period were shaped, at least in part, by the latest London publications of Hermann Moll, a German geographer, cartographer, and engraver, who was publishing important new work about this time. In 1708, he published his 56 new and accurate maps of Great Britain, and thereafter numerous other volumes and separate maps of Great Britain and Ireland and continental Europe and its constituent states. I've done a little bit of work on the background here. These two surviving copies, these are monthly magazines. You could build up a sort of collection of this material. These are dated 1708, but all the textbooks I've found, and if there's any historical geographers in the audience could help me later with the dating of this, all the standard textbooks today say Moll started this series in 1711. But we know these are dated here 1708, and they were being used at St. Omer's at that time. So there's research to be done on that. When you had a complete run of these magazines, you had a complete geography of the world, this Atlas Geographus. And this was completed by 1717, so it was right in the time that Maire was there at St. Omer's. In 1717, the English cartographer John Green, commenting on these magazines, said, if something of this kind had been done earlier, then there had probably been a stop put now to that swarm of spurious maps that are currently abroad. But that which goes by the name of Moll's geography is the most perfect piece that has been writ yet in any language. So this is it's just an illustration from one of Moll's editions of the Atlas. It's the sort of thing that was being used in the school. When he came at the age of 18 to the end of his humanities course at St. Omer's College, Christopher Maire decided to enter the Society of Jesus and entered the English Jesuit novitiate at Wotton, midway between Saint-Omer and Dunkirk, in September 1715, and remained there for the next 3 years. This was the normal place of training for any aspiring English or Welsh Jesuit of the period. In 1718, he was then sent on to continue his studies, his study of philosophy at the English Jesuit College at Liege, and remained there until 1720, and he was to revisit at various stages of his Jesuit formation. You can see the dates here. He went on to do his theology, 1725 to 1733, and then he became a member of the professoriate there later. The college at Liege, founded in 1614 at Louvain, and which had relocated to Liege 10 years later in 1624, had acquired over the following century a formidable reputation as a place for the study of philosophy, theology, the ancient languages, and science. And it was still alive and active in all of these fields when Maire arrived there in 1718. Focusing solely for a moment on the scientific excellence at Liege, the college's reputation in that field had been sealed in the late 17th century by the work of Father Francis Lyne, or Father Francis Hall. He had an alias, as every English Catholic priest did at the time, who was a mathematician and horologist. Lyne had been commissioned by Charles II, who had visited the college at Liege during the Commonwealth period in the 1650s, when he was in exile before before the restoration of the monarchy. He was commissioned by Charles II to construct a, quote, grand pyramidical multiform dial, as it was called, for the Privy Garden at Whitehall. And this very elaborate construction was completed in 1669. Its fame and the fame of the college in Liege increased following Lyne's publication in 1673 of this explication of the functions of this ingenious invention. We haven't time to look into all it did, but it was, quote, esteemed the rarest in Europe, quote, end of quote, in its day. The scientific reputation of the English College at Liege was even higher during Christopher Maire's time there. Maire was taught theology at Liege by the Jesuit Thomas Hildyard, who must surely rank as one of the greatest English clockmakers of the 18th century, but who is really not acknowledged in any way in Britain today, simply because his horological work was largely conducted in continental Europe, off the radar, as it were, of his fellow countrymen and who worked as clockmakers in Britain. During Maire's time at Liege, Hildyard produced, and doubtless to with Maire's knowledge and admiration, a most remarkable clock called the Chronometrum Mirabile Liegeense, the wonder clock of Liege. This slide here shows this clock is a four-faced timepiece. It was purchased shortly after its manufacture by Carlos III of Spain. He was a great collector of clocks and became part of the Spanish royal collection. Few people know anything about this. The clock today resides in the private study of King Felipe in the Zarzuela Palace in Madrid. And through the intervention of the Spanish ambassador in London, I managed to get these photographs of the clock from King Juan Carlos's private secretary just before he abdicated 2 years ago. You see the elaborate nature of it. We haven't got time to look at all this, but a hugely elaborate clock which shows the time, phases of the moon, the tides, all sorts of things. We haven't got time to look at that now. An immensely complex piece of work. I mention all this simply to provide some idea of the sophistication of science and the cultural environment in which Christopher Maire found himself at Liege, and which must surely have influenced him as a cartographer, a scientist, an astronomer. And we know from other sources that Maire, at this time in the 1720s, was making a whole lot of astronomical investigations, recording them all, and ultimately he published them. We'll come back to that a little bit later. To support such work, one needed a very good library, just as a very good library here. And we know that they were using, the students were using the works of Philipp Kluwer, great German geographer of the 17th century, whose works were still being republished at this time. You've got here the inscription. This is at Stonyhurst today. It's got the inscription as having come from the main library at the English College at Liege. And this is the sort of thing that they were using. Just a few illustrations here. Maire was ordained as a priest at Liege in or about 1727. And 6 years later, still at Liege, he became a fully fledged Jesuit, taking his fourth and final vow of obedience to the Pope. Status-wise, this now qualified him to take up the position of Prefect of Studies, or effectively headmaster of St. Omer's College, which he did for 1 year before being promoted Professor of Philosophy, Theology, and Hebrew back at Liege in 1734. There he produced a manuscript theological thesis in 1737 on the Holy Trinity, and also at this time produced one of the first maps of the city of Liege in conjunction with his Walloon Jesuit colleague Nicolas Leclerc. Leclerc did all this part. This is one of the earliest surveys of the independent Prince-Bishopric of Liege. And this map here is Christopher Maire's personal map of the city of Liege. We take a close-up there. This is the cartouche from this, with the details here. Nicolas Leclerc, and done by Christophe Maire. Many French people today think Christophe Maire is a Frenchman, a very French-sounding name, but they don't necessarily know the Durham connection. De la Compagnie de Jésus, of the Society of Jesus here, dedicated to His Highness the Prince Bishop of Liege by the very humble servant P. Père Maire, Father Maire. And that is his actual map of the city of Liege, done about 1738. It's undated, but we can date it to that because we know that the following year, well, that year, he was appointed to the English College in Rome as a member of staff, and he became rector a few years later, in 1744. The college in Rome had been founded by Gregory XIII in 1579 at the behest of Cardinal William Allen, when room capacity had really run out at the English College at Douai, founded in 1568, and the lineal antecedent, of course, of Ushaw College. The Venerable English College was an institution under Jesuit administration at that period. Like the college at Douai, its purpose was to educate and train future members of the secular clergy for England and Wales at a time when such education was quite impossible on English or Welsh soil. Constitutionally, the college was not a Jesuit college, but as I've already said, a college under Jesuit administration. However, in terms of its day-to-day organization at that period, it was so heavily influenced by Jesuit practice, both spiritually and temporally, that effectively it was a Jesuit college in all but name at that period. As rector of the English College, Maire was now in an influential position at the very heart of the Papal States. And it's worth just taking a second to remind ourselves of the state of Italy at that time. Here we have the Papal States running northwards from Rome, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the Kingdom of Sardinia in two sections, Piedmont and Sardinia, but all ruled from Torino, Milan as a separate entity, the Republic of Venice stretching at that time right down into Croatia, down as far as Ragusa, the modern Dubrovnik, here, more about that later, and then Genoa, Parma, Modena, Lucca, and Tuscany. Students of the Venerable English College then, as today, did not receive their formal tuition within the college walls, but went daily or twice daily for tuition in philosophy and theology to the Collegio Romano, here depicted in an engraving, and here's the building today. It's now a high school. This institution had been founded by Ignatius Loyola in 1551, 11 years after the foundation of the Jesuit order. It was an amalgam of what we would today term a secondary school and a university. It was the first ever Jesuit university, all under the same roof. The secondary school element survived down to the political upheavals of 1870 and no longer exists, but the university remains today and thrives as the Gregorian University in Rome. The adjective Gregorian commemorates the fact that Pope Gregory XIII, who'd instituted the Venerable English College, sponsored in 1584 the new building that you can see here, this building here. And by that time, the university possessed chairs in philosophy, theology, moral philosophy, liturgy, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic, mathematics, physics, and astronomy. And the emphasis on the scientific side there, given by the Jesuits, is easily explained. The Jesuits believed then, as they still do today, that God can be found in all things, and that among other fields of study, advanced study of mathematics, physics, and astronomy can provide humanity with glimpses and insights into the power of the Almighty. It was therefore no accident that it was within the walls of the Collegio Romano, or the Università Gregoriana, as it later came to be known, that the potential revision of the Julian calendar was studied and finalized by one of the professors, the German Jesuit Christopher Clavius. Gregory XIII approved the Gregorian calendar, which was eventually adopted universally. The emphasis on finding God in all things found physical expression through the museum in the Collegio Romano, which had been founded by the great Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher, a German Jesuit professor there. I mention this simply to emphasize once again, as I did with Liege, the high-level intellectual environment in Rome in which Maire found himself associated very closely on his arrival in the city in 1738. Soon after his arrival in Rome, Maire met his fellow Jesuit, the Croatian Roger Joseph Boskovic, or Ruggiero Giuseppe Boskovic, 14 years his junior. Boskovic, who being born in Ragusa, the modern Dubrovnik, was half Italian and was a brilliant physicist, astronomer, mathematician, philosopher, diplomat, poet, theologian, and general polymath. He'd been appointed professor of mathematics at the Collegio Romano at the early age of 29 in 1740, and he still held this post when he first met Christopher Maire. The two men, both Jesuit priests, but with very different temperaments, got on well together. Boskovic was an extrovert, very flamboyant, Maire very quiet and reserved, but they shared many intellectual interests in common. Once he had settled into his new duties as rector of the English College, Christopher Maire continued his astronomical observations from the roof terrace of his own college, and he compared these findings with those of Boskovic working down the road at the Collegio Romano, and started publishing the results. So here's Boskovic. And here are some of the publications. And you can see here how the linkages and all the background links together. This is Maire publishing his observations taken at Liege, at Saint-Omer, and in Rome, and comparing them and promulgating them. And here's more work on comets. This is published in 1744. His observations undertaken at the English College in Rome, comparing them with Newton's ideas. And more here on astronomical observation, 1747. During this time, as rector of the English College, Maire entered into extensive correspondence with Jean-Nicolas de Lisle, who was a distinguished French astronomer and cartographer, and the correspondence, Maire's correspondence, survives today in the archives of the Observatoire de Paris. This is part of the correspondence, and here you've got his observations on the eclipse of the sun in Rome in 1748. One of the key problems facing scientists in this period was the question of the precise shape of the Earth. And this concern was soon to change radically the life of Christopher Maire. 10 years before Maire's birth, Sir Isaac Newton had suggested that the effect of gravitational force on the Earth would in all probability produce an oblate spheroid, that is a globe slightly flattened at the two poles, rather than the Earth being a prolate spheroid as depicted in the slide. If this were truly the case and it needed investigation, the implication was that the length of the meridian degree should increase from the equator to the poles. But early measurements did not support Newton's theory. So to try and resolve this matter, the French Academy of Sciences sent out two expeditions, one to the North Pole, and one to Peru in the 1730s to try and find out exactly what the truth was. The papacy maintained a close interest in this work. In 1740, Prospero Lorenzo Lambertini was appointed Pope as Benedict XIV and wanted to continue or to contribute towards this scientific work. To understand the background here, one needs to know briefly a little bit about Benedict, and I'll do this very, very briefly. Lambertini was a man of vast intellectual energy. He was a lawyer by training, but his interests included anatomy, biology, medicine, zoology, geology, elementary physics, and electrical research. And in the Wellcome Institute down in London, they have a wonderful microscope which belonged to him before he ever became a cardinal, before he ever became Pope. The Lambertini coat of arms is here. He was seriously into science. He was director of the Vatican Library and then later Archbishop of Bologna. And during his 9 years in Bologna, he cultivated a circle of intellectual friends who were astronomers, philosophers, obstetricians, and the like, and was very welcoming to British grand tourists, people like William Bentinck, the second Duke of Portland, and his wife, Lady Margaret Harley, who was then the richest woman in Britain and the owner of the largest natural history collection in Britain. Lambertini was a reformer in every sense. He founded the first reformatory in Bologna, a house of correction for delinquents, and took an early interest in inoculation. Becoming Pope, he abolished public flogging in the Papal States, prohibited the use of torture in prisons, appointed a commission for the reform of criminal justice, and promoted female education. He created a new learned academy in Bologna and named a young woman, Laura Bassi, a brilliant scholar, as one of its founder members. And then he appointed Maria Gaetana Agnesi as the first woman professor of mathematics at the University of Bologna. And this is a recent book on her work. He also took an immense interest in, and serious interest in, temporal matters, restoring the Colosseum. His name is there on the here. He restored prominently the Trevi Fountain, and he commissioned Giovanni Battista Nolli to do the famous map of Rome in 1748. This map here, this is the section dealing with St. Peter's and the Vatican. This map was used by the engineering department of the City of Rome right down to the 1970s. It's such a superb piece of cartography. And to return to Christopher Maire, in 1750, events halfway across the world triggered a significant development in the Papal States, which was to impinge hugely on Christopher Maire's life for the next 5 years or more. The Treaty of Madrid of 1750 divided South America, or subdivided South America, into Spanish territory and Portuguese territory. And those of you who've seen the film, the 1986 film, The Mission, will know about all the bloodshed and division and chaos that geographical carve-up caused. Before that took place, however, the King of Portugal in 1750 asked the Superior General of the Jesuits in Rome to send several Jesuit mathematicians and geographers to Brazil to survey the new boundaries. To cut a long story short, when the Cardinal Secretary of State heard that Roger Boscovich at the Collegio Romano wanted to go on this expedition to South America, he carefully diverted him and his interests to the Papal States and suggested that they might do a survey of the Papal States instead. Cardinal Valenti was at the heart of intellectual life in Rome. He had his own private observatory, he had his own art collection, and he is here depicted holding his famous conversazione or salon, where the intellectuals of Rome met in this period. It's highly likely that Cardinal Henry Benedict Stuart, a very young cardinal, brother of Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was godson of Benedict XIV, was involved in discussions about how a survey of the Papal States might be undertaken. It's very likely that Henry Benedict Stuart suggested Maire's name as a potential collaborator with Roger Boscovich. The idea behind this survey was to measure the meridian from Rome to Rimini. Benedict XIV, in 1750, issued an order for Maire and Boscovich to conduct an astronomical and geographical survey along this meridian, which passed through the tower of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and extended as far as Rimini. while the initial impulse for the meridian measurement probably came from Boskovic, Maire, Christopher Maire, was the man behind the idea of using the survey for map-making purposes to produce a new map of the Papal States. At that time, the Greenwich meridian hadn't been fixed, and the French, who were foremost in the field at this period, were using the meridian which ran through the Canaries, through Ferro, or El Hierro as it's called, and the 30th meridian from there ran through Rome and northwards to Rimini. Rimini was exactly 2 degrees north of Rome. And so the survey was financed by Benedict XIV, who extended the finances to allow Maire to do his proposed map. And you've got in your handout there the geography of all this. They took as a baseline, starting at St. Peter's here, with baseline here, the baseline up near Rimini, and ran the survey along the meridian, taking a whole lot of different trigonometrical points for observation. This survey was not simply an intellectual exercise, but one demanding enormous physical stamina. Maire was 53 years old at the start of the expedition in 1750. Boskovic was 39. And if we take a look at some of the peaks, here's Monte Pennino in Umbria, 5,000 feet. Here's Monte Catria, 5,500 feet. The Apennines were a huge physical challenge involving the expedition, involving the carrying of heavy instrumentation. The quadrant, the main quadrant they used weighed over 300 pounds. They had another quadrant, a sextant, many measuring rods besides, which all had to be hauled up as high as these mountains in all types of weather. The membership of the expedition was very small. The 2 Jesuits, accompanied by 4 helpers and 1 servant, all travelling on horseback. In order to measure the angles of the triangles generated by the survey, they had to build mountain-top shacks, or toguria, with inverted V-shaped roofs which would be visible from a long distance. These constructions were often torn down by local peasants who wanted to steal the nails from them, or by other superstitious locals who feared the retribution of the genii they believed inhabited the mountains, who would be jealous of the work of these mapmakers. The treacherous terrain they had to survey ranged from quicksands in the Pontine marshes to dangerously narrow mountain paths. Around Gubbio, they came across bears in the mountains. There were constant problems of unpredictable weather, all of which halted progress at various junctures. Indeed, the cold was so severe that Boskovic suffered from cramp in his hand for months. Near Perugia, on Monte Tessio, they lost all their observational notebooks during a wild storm, and even the help of local peasants, who they paid, failed to retrieve the important documentation. On Monte Pennino, the cloud and rain was so bad that Maire and Boskovic applied to the local bishop to provide a mission to the local people while the weather cleared. They spent 9 days at the foot of the mountain preaching, catechizing, and hearing confessions. And because the meridian ran through Tuscany, they had to get special permission. That took a lot of time to negotiate with the Grand Duke. Could they go on Tuscan territory? The survey took 2 years to complete and ended in November 1752. But not quite, because Maire had to return to some of these regions in 1753 to check various locations and various calculations. In the following 18 months, after the end of the expedition, Maire and Boskovic were busy writing up their report, which appeared in 1755 as De Literaria Expeditione, published on the papal press And this is the copy today in the English College in Rome. It's an enormous tome of 516 pages with extra illustrations. Unfortunately, the English College version is without its illustrations. The most important finding in all of this was the calculation of the meridional circumference of the Earth, which they calculated at this figure here, 39,000 kilometers. If we take the standard today, the calculation today is 40,000. They were out by just 28 kilometers. All this it shows you the exactitude with which and the seriousness with which they undertook this incredible expedition. These are some of the illustrations. These are the quadrants and sextants and other items. I didn't explain that they wanted to absolutely persuade the French, who were foremost in this, being the foremost in these calculations. They wanted to persuade absolutely that they had done this correctly. So they measured it not in English or Italian measures. They applied to Paris to get a measuring model, toise, which was the standard unit of measurement in France at that time, and they measured the whole survey was done in toise. So intellectually they could absolutely persuade and convince the French that they had done this properly. They had really mastered the calculation. So here we have the cartouche of the map by Christopher Maire and Roger Boscovich. And it was done it was such an enormous undertaking to produce the map that it was done in 3 sections. The first, the second here, and the third here. And then this map was so important that it became a template like the future maps. Nobody has seen, I don't think anybody has seen this copper plate. I've just literally a few days ago received this from the Istituto Centrale Cartographer in Rome, which conserves copper plate. We don't have the copper plates, as far as we know, of Maire's actual survey, but this was done in 1769, very soon after the survey, and it's an elaboration of Maire and Boscovich's work. And I put it here, I've reversed the plate with playing back in Photoshop just to show you. It's obviously the original plate is a negative to produce the positive. I've reversed it around just to show you the shape and the elaborate nature of the thing. This 1755 map was a template on which other cartographers built in the future. Very, very influential. Surviving documentary evidence. Just before that, I just explained that Maire was not to see, although he had all these contacts with his French counterparts in Paris, he never to see the French version of the 1755. Sorry, yes. He was never to see the French version of his report. This was published in Paris in 1770 as the Voyage astronomique et géographique. Surviving documentary evidence concerning the life of Christopher Maire after the publication of his magnum opus in 1755 is very sparse. What we do know is, all the indications are that the mental and physical energy required for the Great Survey took a heavy toll on Christopher Maire. I've not found any evidence that he was actively engaged in scientific activity after 1755. The poor man is recorded as having fallen into a gradual mental decline, culminating in his death in Ghent, as I've already said, on this day in 1767. In contrast, Boscovich went from strength to strength, for a time at least. He published in 1758 in Vienna his first edition of his Philosophiae Naturalis Theoria, which sealed his reputation as the father of modern atomic theory. Boscovich visited England and was appointed a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1761, and then went to St. Petersburg and was elected a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He was then appointed Professor of Mathematics at Pavia, and then Director of the Observatory of Brera in Milan for 6 years. And then, when in 1773 the Jesuits were suppressed, Boscovich was appointed Director of Optics for the French Navy, with a very handsome salary of 8,000 livres per annum. He naturalized as a Frenchman and stayed there for 10 years, but eventually returned to Italy and continued his work on optics down to his death in 1787. Over the past 50 years, Boscovich's reputation has grown and grown. If, by contrast, Christopher Maire has hitherto been largely overlooked within the realms of historiography, strangely and surprisingly, he's made a relatively recent reappearance in the world of historical fiction. And very briefly, I'd like to just say a word about this. Thomas Pynchon, the reclusive postmodernist American writer, who will be 80 years old this year, published in 1997 a sprawling 700-page novel entitled Mason and Dixon, which will be doubtless familiar to many of you. Some of the early, middle and closing chapters of the 78-chapter novel are located in County Durham. The narrative focuses on the collaboration of the historical 18th century surveyors Charles Mason and the Bishop Auckland-born Jeremiah Dixon. It tracks their astronomical and surveying exploits in Cape Colony, St. Helena, and Britain, as well as in British North America on the eve of the Revolutionary War of 1776. There, they famously delineated the Mason-Dixon line, which separates Pennsylvania and Maryland. The novel intermingles history, fantasy, legend, speculation, and outright fabrication, and features a range of real-life characters, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Dr. Samuel Johnson, John Harrison, the Yorkshire Marine chronometer maker of longitude fame, and not least, Christopher Maire, as an enigmatic Jesuit and friend of the County Durham mathematician William Emerson of Haworth-on-Tees. In an extraordinary, memorable, but entirely fictional episode in chapter 23 of the novel, which takes place in County Durham, in a tavern in Haworth in 1763, Christopher Maire, with his intimate knowledge of Italy, is persuaded in an impromptu manner by the landlady of the hostelry, Mrs. Brain, to roll up his sleeves and to bake, quote, a delicacy of cheese, bread, and fish ubiquitous in the region around Mount Vesuvius, end of quotation. And he busies himself punching flat a brown batch loaf, adding some Stilton cheese, anchovies, and a touch of exotic ketchup, spelled K-E-T-J-A-P, ketchup, which Jeremiah Dixon, back from one of his overseas surveys, just happens to have in a bottle in his knapsack. When Christopher Maire soon thereafter pulls his concoction out of the oven beside the tavern hearth, it is hailed by the gathered company as arguably the first British pizza. Baked, I might add, a full 202 years before the creation in 1965 of what today is a very well-known British high street pizza chain, famed for producing pizzas very promptly. I began this lecture by pointing out that our understanding of the Catholic Enlightenment has been too long heavily distorted and even obliterated by misrepresentations made by influential philosophes around the time of the French Revolution. As an undergraduate studying the French Revolution in this university more than 40 years ago, I well remember first encountering the philosophy of Condorcet, here pictured in this slide, and I provided on the final page of your handout a short extract and translation from his Esquisse d'un tableau historique, which you might care to read at your leisure. As an undergraduate, I did not accept at face value Condorcet's writings, or at least that passage. And now, with the benefit of many years of further study, I know that that passage is a distortion of historical truth. I hope that I've demonstrated in this lecture that the Catholic Church was, in the 18th century, the mid-18th century, in no sense anti-science or anti-philosophy. The Maire Boscovich survey of 1750-52, sponsored by the papacy and involving 84 locations trigonometrically determined in 2.5 years, together with the published report, stand as a monument to serious scientific inquiry and demonstrate the discipline and determination by Christopher Maire and Ruggiero Boscovich, hardly matched by any other group of civil or military surveyors in the 18th century. To conclude, Boscovich's reputation has been preserved and enhanced in a whole series of ways over the last century, in postage stamps, in Croatian banknotes, in a bust in Zagreb, in a plaque in Paris, in street names in Paris, a crater on the moon, and a major retrospective exhibition in Dubrovnik in 2011. In contrast, Christopher Maire's many contributions to the Enlightenment and to human knowledge more generally have hitherto been sadly overlooked. Probably owing largely to his own natural diffidence, he was the victim of an inequality problem in the realm of reputation during his lifetime, and this situation has endured for far too long. This evening, on this 250th anniversary of his death, may I express the hope that Christopher Maire's unjust neglect will somehow be corrected in the near future, and that here in his home county at least, some means may be found to provide an enduring reminder of a distinguished scientist of international stature and a most distinguished son of County Durham. Thank you.